Welcome to another episode of the Project Reinvented podcast, and I'm your host, Lachlan John McRae. Now, today we are in for a treat. A master of laughter, resilience, and wisdom. He was a writer for The Tonight Show for 20 years. He holds a record for the longest non-stop comedy club road trip ever, working with some of the all-time greats, Jerry Seinfeld, Adam Sandler, Ellen DeGeneres, to name a few. He's not just a comedian. He's the mental health comedian. He's a true beacon of hope and inspiration. He's also the author of the compelling series Guts, Grit and the Grind. Frank King is a TED Talk veteran with 11 talks under his belt. He also currently helps others to get on that TEDx stage. Frank doesn't just crack jokes, he's cracked the stigma around mental health, and he shows us how humour can be a powerful force for change. Let's welcome Frank King, the man who's not only made us laugh, but he's profoundly impacted the mental health conversation. So without further ado, let's talk to Frank. Okay, welcome Frank to the Project Reinvented podcast, and thanks very much for taking time out to come and talk to us here today.
Well, I must tell the folks who are listening or watching, it wasn't my choice. It was part of a plea bargain. I'm kidding.
Well, Frank, I've watched a bit of your stuff and it's amazing. And, some of the things that popped out to me was your authenticity and your vulnerability to share your own life experience, which I think is hugely important to raise the awareness of suicide, and you mentioned something which, blew my mind. It was, you had an itch to scratch that only could be scratched by the nickel-plated 38, and suicide is always on the menu.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that? The experience that you had yourself, and what that means to you as suicide is always on the menu.
Yes, because they are two separate things actually. The itch on the roof of my mouth I could only scratch with the front side on my nickel-plated 38 happened in 2010 after we filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy and lost everything we worked for, my wife and I, for 25 years. And that's when I learned what the barrel of my gun tasted like. Spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger. And if you want to know why not, it's in my first TEDx talk called A Matter of Laugh or Death. The other is I have two mental illnesses, major depressive disorder and chronic suicidal ideation. And major depressive disorder is relatively common. Chronic suicidal ideation is not. That means for me and people in my tribe, the option of suicide is always on the menu as a solution for problems large and small. And when I say small, my car broke down a couple of years ago. I had 3 thoughts unbidden. 1, get it fixed. 2, buy a new one. 3, I could just kill myself. That's chronic suicidal ideation. The upside of that is when I tell that story, oftentimes, most of the time, there's somebody in the audience who has that. They don't know it has a name. They think they're just some kind of freak and completely alone. A young woman came up after a college presentation and said, "Thanks for the keynote." I said, "You're welcome." She goes, "But I got to tell you, it made me weep." "How did it make you weep?" "Well, you talk about your car, get it fixed, buy a new one, kill yourself." I said, "Yes." She goes, "I've been having those thoughts all my life. I thought it was just me. I didn't know it had a name. I thought I was some kind of freak and completely alone. And when I heard you say you have that, I realized, first time in my life, I'm not alone," and I wept.
Yeah, that's amazing, Frank, because see, when I listen to you say it, I've had that thought, and it wasn't even that long ago. I struggled with substance abuse and alcohol for many years, and on more than one occasion, I've thought about killing myself. Now, I've had the belt round my neck, and you said in one of your talks as well. Yeah, so, and you said that that they don't want to die, they just want to remove the pain. And that's exactly what it was for me. I was desperate to remove the pain. I didn't want to leave my family, but the pain was so intense that I didn't know how to deal with it. And when I heard you speak about that, and I think not enough people are talking about this, and and not just that, but even must have been about 6 weeks ago, I was having difficulties, and I had that thought, maybe it was just better if I wasn't here. That would be easier, and So it's like, why are people so scared to talk about this or so scared to come out and discuss it?
Well, again, two separate questions. Scared to come out and talk about it. There is a stigma attached to mental illness and a separate and distinct stigma attached to thoughts of suicide, which I think keeps a lot of people from speaking about it. And if you speak about it in the United States, depending on the state, to a therapist, then the therapist is bound by law to have you taken in front of a judge and decide whether you're going to get a 3-day, 72-hour hold involuntarily in a mental facility. So that's people who are not suicidal, I think, don't talk about it because if they're talking to someone who they think is suicidal, they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing or they don't know what to say. So I think that's why it remains. I wish we could speak about it out loud, those of us who have those thoughts. I believe we could save lives if we weren't worried about the 3-day involuntary hold in a facility with no shoestrings or belt. So.
Yeah, and that blows my mind. It really does, because in this day and age where the I still feel there is a stigma, even though, gone are the days where big boys don't cry, and you're not a man if you show your emotions. I think those days hopefully are gone, but I still think there's a bit of that lingering about, because recently I'm always doing research on this, and it says that the suicide rates in men, is consistently increasing, and the single biggest killer in men under the age of 45 is suicide. But yet there's far more women are diagnosed with depression and attempted suicide. So, and that baffles me. It's like more women are diagnosed with depression and suicide, yet more males are taking their life. So there's obviously still some type of block here, or some type of dissonance to, what men are thinking, or not so much what they're thinking, but their fear of coming forward, especially if you're a middle-aged man. Because for me, I'm a middle-aged man, and that fear of, failing and looking like looking like I'm weak is still there. I still feel that. And even though I know it doesn't matter. I'm a human with emotions, with feelings. But yeah, I still feel that. What's your
Well,
thought?
and I do believe the big boys don't cry / male toxicity is still around. And the proof being that in the United States, roughly 8 out of 10 people who die by suicide are men, generally middle-aged men. And that's why the two co-authors and I put together a series of 4 books on men's mental health. It's stories of men by men for other men. It talks about what their problem is, how that happened, and how they're coping. We're hoping another man will pick it up, see how another guy's coping with it, and think, I can do that. Masculine toxicity. And oddly, 3 times as many women attempt suicide as men. However, men tend to complete because they use a firearm. And as you well know, here in the United States, there are more firearms than there are people. So it's very easy to get your hands on a firearm.
Yeah, and because we don't have firearms, we have them here, but they're not as readily available as they are in the US. Now, have you seen a change, say, in the past, 10 years, with the, the health, or the government or the governing bodies, actively trying to make a difference, try to, go out there and help people?
Not here in the U.S. That's, because the gun lobby is very wealthy. It supports a goodly number of politicians. So the idea of sensible gun legislation, it it never makes it out of committee. It never gets a vote. It's probably not going to happen. Until recently, they did not allow the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, to study gun violence as a health and safety issue. Just recently, they finally passed legislation that the Center for Disease Control can study that and share their findings. It's sad, but it's true. And by the way, maybe you know this, maybe you don't. They separate the opioid deaths from the suicide deaths, because with opioids, you never know unless there's a note whether they died by suicide or just overdosed. And by the way, things are getting better in some ways. More people are talking about suicide out loud, more men. However, when I did my first TEDx talk, in the United States, 39,000 people a year died by suicide. In 2022, a little over 49,000 died by suicide, another 10,000 per year. So it's not getting better. In some ways, it's getting worse.
And so, and you've obviously been doing this for a long time. What would be, if you were in charge, and you were talking to, the regular Joe like myself, what would you advise, the families to do? People who, just regular families. What warning signs? What could you ask them to look out for? In just regular cases, what kind of traits or behaviors or that would you look at?
And this is what I talk about in my keynote. My job is to empower the audience to save a life, because the good news is, here's some good news. 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent. They cannot make up their mind. And 9 out of 10 give hints in the last week leading up to an attempt, which means you can make a difference. You can save a life, and you can do it by doing something as simple as we're doing here, and that is starting a conversation, if you know how. And then I tell the audience, okay, signs of depression. Not an exhaustive list, but my top 3. The person eats too much or can't eat, sleeps too much or can't sleep. They have trouble getting out of bed in the morning, so often late for work or school, but rally in the afternoon like a different person. And here's one you can observe visually. They let their personal hygiene go. Normally, they're pretty well put together. Hair clean, clothes clean. And this day, the hair's a little dirtier, the clothes aren't quite so clean. It may be because they're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning to run a load of wash and take a shower. The question comes up, what do you say to somebody who's depressed? Well, here's what you don't say. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Turn that frown upside down. My personal favorite, have you tried fish oil? At which point I go from suicidal to homicidal. What you do say is, I'm here for you and I mean it. I know you're not lazy or crazy or self-absorbed. I know that depression is a mental illness. But here's the good news. With time and treatment, things will get better. I will take the time to help you get the treatment. And here's the difficult question to ask at this point. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Just like that. There's no wives' tale that should never mention the word suicide in front of somebody who's depressed. And I love the reasoning, because it might give them the idea. Suicide? What a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? Trust me, it crossed my mind. So let's say they don't admit they're having thoughts of suicide, but your gut tells you, and I say go with your intuition, that they're circling the drain. How would you know? Well, they talk about death and dying. You catch them Googling death, dying, or how to die by suicide. Death and dying may appear as a theme in their artwork or their music or their writing. Here's a counterintuitive one, very dangerous. They've been depressed for a long time. Now they're happy for no apparent reason. They may be happy because they've chosen time, place, and method, and they know the pain is coming to an end. And here's another one you can observe very easily. They're getting their affairs in order, especially if they're giving away prized possessions, because they want to make sure those possessions go to the people they want them to go to when they're gone. So then what if they tell you they are having thoughts of suicide? What do you say? You say, do you have a plan? And if the plan is detailed, time, place, and method, you need to get them as quickly as possible to a mental health facility simply for evaluation. Find out what's going on. People ask me, what would you do? I said, I would get them to a mental health facility and see exactly what is it. Garden variety depression? Is it the depression or depressive state of bipolar. And I would also recommend a physical, have a full physical. Sometimes physical ailments present as mental health issues. And now the question comes up, what to do if they have a plan for suicide, but it's not particularly detailed. I've never read this or learned this in any class I've taken on suicide prevention. A psychiatrist and I came up with it. So let's say they've got a plan, but it's not really detailed. What would you say? I would say, okay, tell me, are you going to kill yourself? And if they say no, I would say, okay, tell me why not. Make them give voice to whatever's keeping them here, because something is keeping them here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be having this conversation. Could be family, friends, religion, pets, who knows, whatever it is. That way you can leverage that to help keep them safe for another day.
Wow, that's great advice there. And because I know the stigma is still around, but you mentioned something as well in one of your talks, and it was the generational and depressive disorder. Is that what it was? Where this can actually be generational from your family? Because I know what you've went through. We haven't spoke about it, but in your family history, there's been suicide. There's been your aunt and I think it was your grandmother.
That's my grandmother, my great aunt. My grandmother died by suicide. My mother found her. My great aunt died by suicide. My mother and I found her. I was 4 years old and I screamed for days. And the thing about being hardwired for depression and suicide, generational depression and suicide, if you're that close to an actual suicide, and when you hear the story of my TED Talk, you'll know nobody could get any closer, then the chances of you seriously considering taking your life later in life go up. And that's what happened in 2010. So, yeah, the joke I have is there are more nuts in my family than in a squirrel turd. So that's one of the reasons. One of the reasons I speak on it is because people say, can you be cured? No, it's in my DNA. It's just as much in my DNA as comedy is. Almost all my family is funny, and almost all my family is crazy. So it's just. But I've learned to live with it. I used to say that I fight depression, but that's a misnomer. You can't fight it because you can't win. Fighting implies you're going to win. I can tie and stay alive or lose and die by suicide. So, and I know my cycle. It's important that people learn their cycle. Mine's 72 hours. And I know when I start cycling down, like somebody's turned up the force of gravity, I know 72 hours later, roughly, it'll be cycling back up and I'll be fine. The problem for young people is they haven't been through that cycle as many times as I have. And in the downside, cycling down depression, people tend to think in the immediate. If it's never going to be any better than this, and I don't think it is, then why bother? So, I mean, I've been through it so many times that I know exactly. I just ride the wave, go with the energy rather than try to spend a lot of energy fighting it.
So what do you mean by the cycle? Is that, you identify thoughts, feelings, behaviors? What do you mean by that? The cycle of going down?
Most people have a finite length cycle for the depression. I mean, there are people who are chronically depressed and they're depressed, I suppose, consistently. And a lot of neurotypical people think that if you are living with depression, it's 24/7, 365. That's not necessarily the case. With a self-care plan, including diet, exercise, good night's sleep, medication, meditation, I have more good days than bad. However, I do know my cycle. And a friend of mine who had lived with bipolar for decades, bipolar disorder, said, Frank, I know you're not going to believe this, but there are triggers. So next time you begin a cycle down, look back and see if there's a common element that precedes your cycle. And sure enough, I found a couple things that will send me into a tailspin. One of them is disappointing my wife. Being mad at me is one thing, but disappointed says to me, you could have done better. I expected better. And man, that will send me into a tailspin in no time. And here's the upside of letting your relatives, friends, family, anybody you trust know. When I say, are you mad? And she knows, that the word disappointment triggers me. She'll go, no, honey, I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. So we can actually joke about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's generally people have a cycle, X number of days, hopefully not weeks or months. And generally there's a trigger or two that can, it can happen without a trigger, but there are triggers that can, actively make it happen.
So it's about having that awareness then, of your thoughts, your behaviors, what's going on around you. And I could link that much to like when I was in active addiction. I'd be trying to get sober, something would trigger me and it would take me on that downward spiral. And as I became more aware of my triggers, I could, not walk past a certain shop or go a different route home so I wasn't passing the liquor store. So I could avoid these, controllable triggers. But and that just comes down to being aware and looking back and studying your actions, your
Yeah.
behaviors, how you feel and everything like that. That's great. And you spoke about your health, your fitness, meditation, because for me personally, these are the same things that keep me sober. My exercise, making sure I'm looking after my health, what I eat. But meditation and journaling has been probably the most profound thing that I've ever done in my life to keep me aware of my thoughts, and my actions as well. So when you identified, or you've probably always known, you have always known that you've had these. How long have you been meditating for example?
Since the early 1990s, a friend of mine gave me something called the Catnapper. At the time, it was on a cassette tape, then a CD, now MP3. It's a 29-minute guided meditation. Takes you down, brings you back up, recharge. It's like, remember when computers in the 90s, if it wasn't working and you called customer service, well, try unplugging it, plugging it back in. That's kind of, and when you speak, you want to teach them something, learning objectives. When they hear Frank speak, they'll learn how to. And then you want to leave them with the next logical step, which is after they've heard Frank speak, they'll be able to. So I encourage them, everybody, neurotypical, neurodiverse, whatever, to have a self-care plan. And I talk about mine. And it's diet. I'm on the keto diet, do intermittent fasting, exercise. I'm actually a master's bodybuilder, over 60 bodybuilder. So I'm in the gym every day. So diet, exercise, good night's sleep. People discount a good night's sleep. It always scares me when somebody goes, "I can get by on 3 hours sleep a night." Oh, not for long, you can't. Diet, exercise, good night's sleep, meditation, the Catnapper, twice a day after a meal, and medication. I didn't take any medication until I was 60. I took an over-the-counter supplement called SAM-E. SAM-E. You can buy it here in the States at Costco. It's really good on three things. It's good for your liver, it's good for your joints, and it's good on mild depression. When I turned 60, my wife said, "Look, just go to the doctor, ask him for, some antidepressants." So I went in and saw my doctor. I said, "I want some antidepressants." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I can tell you what the barrel of my gun tastes like." He could not write that prescription fast enough. And you know what? 2 weeks in, my wife noticed a change in my personality. I didn't, but she didn't say anything. She wanted to see if I noticed. 3 weeks, it hit me. I had this thought for the first time since I was 18. I like my life, just bubbled up out of nowhere. Now, bear in mind, I've got a good life. Been married 37 years, wonderful pets, nice little house, doing a thing, for a career that I love, but still living with depression. And the medication, just a small amount of one, and mine happened to work. That medication worked right away, which is not always the case. Here's something your listeners or viewers should know. About a third of medications, psychotropics, work really well for people. About a third, people think, it's not bad. And the other third, it sucks. So if you are on a medication and it's not working, there's a DNA cheek swab test. You send your DNA to one of half a dozen labs, and I don't know if they're all over the world, but they're half a dozen in the US. And they will do their best to match your DNA to a psychotropic medication that works best with your metabolism. So it cuts down on the experimentation. Go on, doesn't work, taper off. Go on, doesn't work, taper off. And what I tell the audience is that can you spot the theme, the through line in my self-care plan? The through line is those are all things I can control. I learned long ago, only try to control the things you can control, whether it's business or life or mental illness. As you know, the rest of it's above my pay grade. I can't do anything about politics, about the pandemic. I can only control. So those are all things I can control. And by the way, you mentioned journaling. One of my clients, one of my TEDx coaching clients, he has something called the 5 pillars of recovery from mental illness. And one of them is one non-negotiable item in your self-care plan. And mine is working out. Now, I achieve that in a number of ways. There's something called gamification. You make a game of it. For example, if I'm having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, not physically, but mentally, I'll make a physical to-do list, pencil and paper to-do list, half a dozen things. And the game is, once I scratch off number 6, Lachlan, I don't care if it's 3 in the afternoon and broad daylight, I can go back to bed and do what I've been wanting to do all day long, pull the covers over my head, and watch the next episode of Jack Ryan on Netflix or Prime or wherever it is. So it's called gamification. And I do that with the gym. The gym's 25 minutes away. Yeah, the hardest thing about the gym is getting there. I mean, I got a car. I get there no problem physically. So the deal is, if I get to the gym all dressed out, I can go in if I want to, do one repetition of one exercise, turn around and go home. Now, I've never done that. I was in there about 90 minutes, but the option's there if I'm not feeling it. So that's gamification. The last thing I tell them is I believe, Lachlan, you should have a schedule. During the pandemic, they asked a guy who'd been in the space station almost a year by himself, except when they brought groceries up, how in the world do you survive that social isolation? He said one word: schedule. I go to bed same time, get up same time. I eat at the same time. I meditate at the same time. I binge watch Netflix at the same time. I work out at the same time. I believe you should have a schedule. You should figure out what your circadian rhythms, when you should be sleeping, are, and stick to it. And turns out, and I fought this for years, I'm a comedian. How could I be a morning person? How? Turns out, guess what? I am. I mean, radically morning. I go to bed between 6 and 7 at night, and I get up between 2 and 3, because this time of day right now, here in the U.S., where it is 6:33 in the morning, I'm right smack in the middle of my most productive time of day. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I don't want to talk to anybody. I try not to schedule anything after 5 o'clock because I'll be grumpy. So the self-care plan, gamification, schedule would be my advice. And listen, during the pandemic, more than one person called me because they were concerned because, I have mental illness. And how was I surviving the pandemic? Here's the thing. I have a self-care plan. Had one going in, had one coming out. But what my stock answer was, look, this pandemic, I've had 2 aortic valve replacements, a double bypass, a heart attack, 3 stents. I live with 2 mental illnesses, and I lost to a puppet on the original Star Search. This is not the worst thing that's ever happened to me.
It's keeping the humor though, and that's I just look at you, Frank, and I watched your shows. You're a comedian. You wrote for was it Tonight Show for 20 years. You have all these accomplishments, and your humor is so bright and breezy. But then you look behind that, and there's obviously been a lot of pain for you throughout that whole time. And if you can rise above it with what you're telling people to do with your care plan, with your schedule, with structure, then, anybody can do it. And it's about taking the right action is what you're saying there. Because for me, what you're saying is pretty much identical to how I stay sober. It's the same thing. I go to bed about 7, 8. I'm up at 4 o'clock. I have a pretty much identical, sleep, wake up, and my productiveness in the morning is my best. But that's because I have a plan that's in place. And a minute ago, you spoke about your life. What you do is, you love your career. Now, how did that come about? Now, I know how it came about, but I want my my listeners to understand how you went from, a regular job to comedy, and to becoming this mental health advocate, because I think it's great because you spoke about that plus the entrepreneurs, but it all ties into the one thing.
Yes. And I did a TEDx talk, my fourth one. It was called Suicide, the Secret of My Success, Dead Man Talking. By the way, they liked the title and subtitle so much that the TEDx folks didn't make me audition. They said, no, man, you're on. So what happened, Lachlan, was I was after college. I actually told my first joke in the fourth grade at age 9. The kids laughed. The teacher was hysterical. She had to go to the teacher's lounge. She was laughing so hard. 12th grade, last year of public school in the U.S., they had a talent show. Nobody had ever done stand-up. I did, and I won. Of course, I beat the folk dancers and the accordion player. Not a tough win. And then I was going to go to L.A. My mom said, no, you're going to college first. I don't care what you do when you get done. You can be a goat herder for all I care. But you're going to be a goat herder with a college degree. So I went to college, got a couple of degrees, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then went to work for an insurance company. They transferred me to San Diego. And in San Diego, just by chance, there's a branch of the world famous Comedy Store, the one up on Sunset in LA. And so picture this. I'll tell you, this is how the TEDx starts. What would you do if you knew for a fact that you had absolutely nothing to lose? What audacious goal would you go after if you knew for a fact that by not pursuing that goal, you would literally die? That's where I was in January of 1984. I was married and miserable, fine young woman. We just didn't belong together. Well, you know what they say. We had nothing in common. But you know what they say. Opposites attract. She was pregnant. I wasn't. Wonderful woman. And in fact, she was not pregnant. I just made up that joke. I was selling insurance, which is a great business, but just not for me. I hated every minute of it. And I was driving down Highway 163 in the rain one day in January, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which is where my biorhythms bottom out. And the thought crossed my mind, because I'm miserable. Why don't you just kill yourself? My second thought was very empowering, which was, well, I could divorce my wife, quit my job, try comedy. If it works, and I think it will, great. If it doesn't, hell, I can always kill myself. So I got separated from my wife. I kept working in insurance because I needed an income while I was doing open mic nights. But I went to my first open mic night on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 84. Lachlan, halfway through my set, inside my head, a little voice said this: you're home. I knew that's where I belonged. And 18 months later, I said to my girlfriend, now my wife of 37 years, I am going on the road to be a stand-up comedian. Do you want to come along for the ride? Thinking she'd say, Lachlan, oh, hell no. She goes, yeah. So we gave up the apartment, gave up our jobs, jumped in the car, and we were on the road together. She just came along for the ride for 2,629 nights in a row, nonstop, 7 years and change. Wow. Comedy club to comedy club to comedy club. I worked with Seinfeld and Dennis Miller and Steve Harvey and Rosie and Ellen, Adam Sandler, Kevin James, back when they were just comedy. Dr. Young, Dr. Ken, Retta from NBC's Bad Girls or Good Girls, and I think Community Center or one of those. Anyway, so in the mid-'90s, I got a chance to do radio. So I did radio for about a year and a half, and like most people in radio, there are two kinds of people in radio, Lachlan. People who have been fired, people who are going to be fired. Got fired and realized the comedy club scene was dying, but my act was very clean. So I could do corporate comedy, what they call in the U.S. the rubber chicken circuit, because they always serve rubber chicken, chewy chicken at the conferences. So I did that until 2000 through 2007. 2007, I had 96 engagements doing corporate comedy. I made over $200,000 telling jokes. And then the recession hit. In 2008, business dropped off 80%. By 2010, I'd burned every line of credit I had, and that's when we filed bankruptcy. That's when I came close to killing myself. The reason I was going to kill myself was the bankruptcy was just devastated my wife. And I thought, I've got $1 million life insurance policy. I can fix this. Because in suicidality, there's something called burdensomeness. You feel like you're a burden on your family, on your friends, on the world. The world would be better off without you. And I thought, well, she'll be brokenhearted, but she won't be broke. Problem, Lachlan, was I'd sold insurance, life insurance. I knew there's something in every life insurance policy called an incontestability clause, which includes a suicide clause. And in most policies, you have to wait at least 2 years, pay at least 2 years before you die by suicide, or it pays nothing. So I called my agent, found out I'd only paid for it for 22 months. Fortunately, because if it had been 24 months or better, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I thought, well, I got to wait 60 days to kill myself. I can do that. I wasn't marking days off the calendar. Can't remember when day 61 came. Things got better a bit. Bankruptcy went through, phone calls stopped. So I'm still here. But when I came out that other side of that, I'd always, since I began doing comedy, I wanted to make a living at comedy, and Lachlan, more importantly, make a difference. But I could never figure out how to do that. And a friend of mine named Judy Carter, who's a comedian and speaker, wrote a book called The Message of You. The Message of You. If you're listening to this and you want to be a keynote speaker, The Message of You by Judy Carter. The subtitle is fabulous. Turn your life into a money-making speaking career. Judy sent me a copy. Frank, read it. You'll figure it out. I went into it, Lachlan, thinking I got nothing. And halfway through, she was absolutely right. I thought, wait a minute. Given my family history, my mental health history, my close brush with suicide, I could keynote on suicide prevention if I got some training and certifications, which I have. Now, second hurdle, Lachlan, I've been doing stand-up for 2.5 decades at this point. Who is going to believe that I can do anything serious? That's when I applied for my first TEDx talk. And it was on suicide prevention. It's all about starting the conversation. Because what I realized as I was preparing for it, even though hardly anybody talks about it, if you bring it up, almost everybody has a story. So my clients will tell me when I go to work, keynote for them, we just brought you in here to start the conversation on suicide. When I do a keynote, I do a general Q&A at the end. But before I start that, I say to the audience, look, we're going to do some Q&A. If you have a question you want to ask or a story you want to share and you don't want to do it in front of everybody, I always allow an extra 45 minutes afterwards to do that. And there's always a line, sometimes just 2 people, sometimes 10. And most of their stories start like this. I've never told anybody this. And I say, I get that a lot. What I've done by getting on stage and being vulnerable, especially a man, is I've given them permission to give voice to their feelings and experiences surrounding depression. And I mean, probably the most dramatic incident, I was speaking on a construction site, because construction in the U.S. has the highest rate of suicide. 1,000 people die by accident in construction every year. Get this, 5,000 die by suicide. You're 5 times more likely to jump off the building than fall. So the last guy in line was a young black man, probably mid-20s. He's crying in front of all his, workmates. And I waited for him to gather himself, and I said, what's up? He said, well, I haven't slept for 2 nights. I work on the 5th floor, and I think about jumping off the building every day. I said, why is that? He said, because I've lost 3 people close to me in the last year to violence. And one was my daughter who died in my arms. That's the kind of thing that happens if you open the conversation. The human resources guy happened to be standing there. I said, look, you need to take this nice young man by the hand to a mental health facility immediately for evaluation because he's circling the drain. A couple of months later, I called back fearing what I might hear. And the meeting planner said, no, Frank, he got evaluated, medicated. He's back on the job. So That's the difference. My goal is to save a life a day. And by the way, your listeners and viewers should know, nobody knew I was depressed and suicidal officially. They might have guessed it occasionally, but until I did that TEDx talk, I came out of the mental health closet on that TEDx talk. When my wife's about to play the YouTube video, I said, stop. I need to tell you some things you don't know about me that you're going to hear on that video. So I recommend that if you are living with a mental illness, I would share that with anybody you know, like, and trust, because it's kind of like racing NASCAR. You need a pit crew. And in NASCAR, you don't start looking to hire a pit crew when the car rolls into the pit. You need to have them there and ready to go. By the way, that's the theme of those 4 books. They're called Guts, Grit, and the Grind, and Mental Mechanics Manual. And it's written like an automobile owner's manual. We figure that way guys might pick it up. And full of automobile metaphors, like the pit crew. When you buy a car, you get AAA or similar, because at some point the tire's going to go flat or the battery's going to go dead. That's kind of how with mental illness you need to prepare ahead, and you need to prepare the people around you ahead. So that's how I got from comedy to from a funny speaker, Judy Carter would say in The Message of You, from a funny speaker to a speaker who is funny. And you know what the difference is between the two, Lachlan?
Go for it.
About $7,500 plus travel. I can't seem to convince my comedian friends to jump ship and do corporate.
Yeah, and that, just for anyone that's listening, I'm going to put Frank's links in the description for his TED Talks and his book. The book's a 4-part series. I actually tried to get it before we were going live, but because I'm in the UK, I couldn't even get it on Kindle. I had to order it, so I couldn't get it before we discussed to have a chat about it. But I'll put it in the description, because it's a 4-series part, so it's Guts, Grit, and the Grind. That's right. And then the TED Talks as well. Now, just, see, when you're speaking about this, now, does this drain you emotionally when you're talking about it, when you're talking to people who are going through this? How do you prioritize your own mental health when you're actively engaging in the prevention of suicide for others, try to help other people?
It does drain my energy a bit. People ask me, does it trigger you to tell your story over and over? No, because remember I talked about that line of people? It's very therapeutic that perhaps I am helping improve a life or save a life. It's one of the reasons I tell the audience. Remember we talked about, you're not going to kill yourself? Tell me why not. Every now and then somebody will ask me that question after a speech. Are you going to kill yourself, Frank? No. Tell me why not. Well, one of the reasons is that line of people. I feel sort of like, the character George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah.
The angel shows him what all those people's lives would be like if he weren't simply there. And I feel like I've been shown what these people's lives would be like, the ones lined up, what their lives would be like if I weren't there to reassure them, to listen to their story, to share a word of advice. And if I kill myself, then in theory, I could take a lot of those people with me. And you know what? I got that idea from a friend whose dad was in recovery from alcoholism for 20 years. Somebody asked him at about the 18-year mark, are you ever going to drink again? And he said, no. And they said, how do you know that? And he said, because of all the people I have, sponsored.
Yeah.
And all the people I'm going to sponsor. If I dive back into that bottle, I would take a lot of them with me, and I can't.
And that is powerful. That is powerful, because that's when you're leaning into service, because I believe what you're doing is amazing, because there's nobody else out there that I've seen. The mental health comedian, when people look at it, they have to take a second glance, because they're like, what is this? And then you hear your sense of humor, which is quite dry, and some of the things, and it's amazing, and I think you've obviously found your purpose, because you're helping thousands of people directly and indirectly, because, even by me coming across you, I feel more confident in speaking about it, because I've done some videos on Facebook about it and spoke about it, but I've never really spoke deeply about my own, cases of trying to kill myself. I've not went that deep, and I've touched on it briefly, but now it's a case of, if I want to be of service to others, then I have to be vulnerable and let them see that I'm opening up, so that you can then open up to me or anyone else, because at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about me trying to help other people. So I'm removing the focus from me and placing it on service to serve others. And
Well, and you
that's what I've
notice
got.
there's a guy named. I would encourage you to do that. There's a guy named Donald Miller who wrote a book, and my veterinarian read the book and he summarized it for me. He said, Frank, you need to make whoever you're talking to the hero in the piece. He goes, as a veterinarian, when people come in and say, you saved my dog's life. He says, no, you brought the dog in. That saved the dog's life. I just did my part. So you notice when I talked about speaking to an audience, I said to them, you can make a difference. You can save a life. I'm not there to save lives. I'm there to empower them and you, Lachlan, to save a life. And I believe that's the formula. Empower others to make them the hero in the piece.
Yeah, and I totally agree, because that's the whole reason of this podcast. It's called Project Reinvented because my mission is to help 1 million people reinvent their lives. And whether that's through helping them with addiction, with mental health, with just physical health, whatever it is, because I'm specialized in each of these areas. And, and when you spoke about the entrepreneur part in one of your videos, you said about a third of them will be doing what they're doing because they had no other choice. Like you said, well, I'll either that or kill myself. And I was like,
Yep.
this is why I'm doing the podcast. And I only realized that when I listened to what you said, because I was so unhappy at doing what I was doing. It was like the universe was doing everything against me and forcing me into this place where I had to actually go for what I wanted. Otherwise, I didn't want to live. I didn't, because I was so miserable. And 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 I took the jump. And see, since I've took the jump, it was like this cloud has been lifted from me. And it's like, I don't have to, I've got no pressure on me, nothing. It's just now I'm getting an opportunity to do what I want to do because I've removed the pressure or the weight from trying to fit expectations of other people, of society, of this, that, and the next thing. And I've just allowed myself to go for what I truly want. And so it was amazing to hear the stuff that you had said, and I could identify with it, so much of it. So anyone that's listening, I will put the links for Frank's TED Talks in here, and there's a lot of them. I think it's 11, Frank. I think you're the world's record TED Talk holder, and you've got another one coming.
Yes, 12 coming up. And by the way, the TEDx folks do not like the fact that anybody has more than 4 talks. I found that out when I did my 5th one, which sadly, because it never went up on YouTube and I couldn't get any video, just stills. Sadly, because it's the only one I've ever gotten a standing ovation for. And it is my favorite to this day. It's called Mental Health and the Orgasm. Treat your depression single-handedly.
Yeah, that's because I did hear you speak about that one, and you got immediately you got okayed for that. But so because I couldn't find all of them, I could only find I think it was about 4 or 5 of them.
You won't.
Yeah,
and that's it. They won't put them up anymore.
Well, everyone I find, I will link here because they were so helpful to me. Plus, I'll put a link to the book, and I'll put the link to Judy's book because I found that link in a different podcast you done with a lady who was talking about some type of kind of event that she was doing. I can't remember where it was, but it was a lovely woman. You were speaking to her, and you were talking about suicide. And I know I'm conscious of time. Frank, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to touch on? You would like to talk about before we finish up here today?
Yes, I want to give the TEDx people a hard time because, Lachlan, they will tell you it's not about the speaker or the person. It's always about the idea. Well, it seems to me they're taking it out on me personally because you've seen my TEDx talks. Just think those other 11, those other, 7 would undoubtedly save and or change lives. And they refuse to put them up, which grinds my gears. But, it's their business, their job. I put my cell phone number, by the way, up every time I speak on the screen. And I say, look, if you're having thoughts of suicide, call the suicide hotline or text it. Having a bad day, call a crazy person. Here's my cell. And about once every 2 weeks, somebody will call with a question about themselves or a loved one or, just just to share, a moment and a story. I think like to leave people with 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent. 9 out of 10 give hints in the last week leading up to the attempt, which means you can make a difference. You can save a life, and you can do it by doing something as simple as we're doing right here, and that is start the conversation. And now, thanks to Lachlan and myself, you know how.
Yes. And where can people find you, Frank? Because
I'm in
I
witness
checked.
protection.
Yeah, because I clicked on, because I know you train TEDx speakers, and I want to be a TEDx speaker. So I actually looked to click on your link, but one of the links that I got wasn't working. So I just wanted to double check that I've got the correct links for you.
Well, it's not working because TEDx busted me for copyright and trademark infringement. Maybe take it down.
Right.
If you're curious about my suicidal prevention speaking, it's mentalhealthcomedian.com. Mentalhealthcomedian.com. If you're curious about making money speaking and doing a TEDx, it's howtomakemoneyspeaking.com. And by the way, Lachlan, I was trying to, after TEDx busted me and said you can't use TEDx Coach anymore, whatever it was, I'm trying to think of a URL. And my wife goes, well, try howtomakemoneyspeaking.com. And, I'm thinking, Lachlan, that has got to be gone decades ago.
Yeah.
I typed in GoDaddy, howtomakemoneyspeaking.com. It came up available. I could not believe it. So all of my, TEDx coaching curriculum and my Make Money Speaking curriculum are there. That's how people can get in touch with me for that.
Perfect, because that's the thing. You're not just this advocate for mental health. You're also a coach who helps people speak and make money from speaking, like you do, and that's actually
and be of service.
Yeah, and that's my biggest dream is I say it every morning because I believe choice is we all have choice. So every morning I make choices and I put them down, write them on paper, and one of them is I choose to be a speaker, speaking on the biggest stages, making the biggest impact throughout the world. And I believe one day that will be me. But
well, you should be, Lachlan.
Yes.
You should be speaking. Yes, absolutely. Again, because vulnerability, as Brene Brown says, is a superpower, and a man being vulnerable is like a superpower. So you need to be up there.
Yeah. Listen, Frank, I totally appreciate your time, and I will support you in any way I can. And I'm pretty sure the listeners here will be doing the same because you've shared some, invaluable information. And if anyone is looking for further information, I will put my contact details there. I'll have Frank's there. And I'm always happy to help. I always put my contact details. If anyone wants to reach out and have a personal conversation, just let me know. I will always make myself available. And that's it, Frank. We'll leave it there, and hopefully we can do this again at some point. Thanks very much for your time.
And let me close out the podcast as a comedian would.
Let's go for it.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe, and tell your friends. If you did not enjoy this podcast, well, we hope you have no friends.
Legendary. I just want to close with a big massive thank you. See, Project Reinvented has never been about me. It's always been about you, the listener who's looking to improve their life. So with that, I just want to express my sincere gratitude to each and every one of you for not only listening, but your continued support. Project Reinvented wouldn't exist without your presence, so thank you. My goal is to make this as personal to you as possible, so your feedback is invaluable to me, always welcomed and always appreciated. So as we go on this journey together, remember, the art of reinvention doesn't always demand big, massive leaps. See, big change starts with small steps. So think about this. What's one small action you can take today that will reignite your journey of life reinvention? Make that decision to take that step. See, life's a canvas, reinvention's the art, and you're the artist. So start creating. See you next week.